nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Come, Holy Ghost,
fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy divine love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created. And thou shalt renew the face of the earth.
Oremus. Deus qui corda fidelium Sancte Spiritus illustratione doquisti, da nobis in ad Spiritu recta sapere, ed ego sempre consolatione gaudere, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Cor Iesus sacratissimum,
Miserere nobis,
Cor Maria Immaculatum,
ora pro nobis,
Sancte Joseph,
ora pro nobis,
Sancte Pie Decime,
ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
So this is the instruction, and in our times of this crisis of the church, it's kind of worse than a crisis. It's a total upheaval, and it's Operation Suicide 10 times over, as Archbishop Lefebvre called it. So it's good to look back at the heroes who went through similar persecutions in the Vendée in France, the Catholics in Austria at the same time, at that same era, the Catholics in England, the Catholics in Spain under the 1936 to 39 persecution, and in Mexico from 1926 to 30, the persecution with the uprising of the Cristeros. So what better candidate to have to speak and add in some things on the Cristeros than Father Ruiz here. So, it's not often we get the priests together. So it's a good opportunity for you to raise some questions in this instruction, and also to be inspired by the example of these great Cristeros that raised up great martyrs, from little boys to great ladies and men that went to death. The Saint Joan of Arc Brigade. The Cristeros, they say they couldn't have victory, and they couldn't have moved so swiftly without the help of the women, because the women helped transport ammunition, they transport medicine, they transported communication between the generals. So how about we let you just start, Father, and you can just say whatever, and then we'll cover that. And this is also an opportunity to raise any other questions you might have because tomorrow the retreat ends and everybody scatters, and you don't have much time to talk unless you're going to stay till Sunday. So this is a good opportunity. It's a little unusual on the retreat, I know, but our times are unusual. So this is part of the retreat, because it's part of the battle. And as Cardinal P said, you can't have holiness without the combat against error and heresy and modernism. So now, Father, I asked Father today if he had any relatives that were Cristeros. Did you have relatives that were Cristeros?
What is relatives?
Family.
Family. Yes, is the father and mother of my grandmother.
So great-grandparents.
Great-grandparents help the Cristeros because he have a ranch like here, and the Cristeros sometimes come to ask something to eat, and here he gives always something to eat, and
The Cristeros come always clean and beautiful whites, you know. And when come the soldiers are all not clean, how you say,
Dirty.
dirty and not beautiful. But the Cristeros are always good presentation, nice, and he have respect of the people, and the soldiers not. There is one of great parents that have scapular, maybe, or the cross, and he want to kill him because he have that, and is by he have a big risk to be killed, but that he is not killed, but he have a big risk.
Can you hear in the back? You can hear? Okay.
And my
Great grandparents.
my grandparent, was child, which was is a child in this moment, and he take his many sacks, how you say,
Luggage?
with something to eat, and he go alone to the mountains to give to the Cristeros, and he make that usually, but he's a boy, a little boy. What?
Era niño.
Sí, sí. He was a little boy, and in this moment his parents give him something to eat, many things, and he go to the mountains to give to the Cristeros. And there is another case. We have a priest that was martyr in. But it's not the near family. It's family, but it's not very near. We have some parenting. How you say? We are tenemos alguna.
Distant relatives?
Tenemos es familia lejana, pero no es familia cercana, pero sí es familia.
So you have distant relatives that were martyrs.
Yes,
A priest that was martyred.
one priest martyr.
Wow. Okay.
But it's not near family. It's family, but it's not very near. But there are.
Right.
And the center, or we can say the center of the Cristiada is Jalisco, and the center of the Cristiada in Jalisco is the Altos de Jalisco. The region is of my mother, Cam. And
Yeah, his mother comes from the region of Jalisco.
the Altos de Jalisco is a region, a region of the north of Jalisco. And there is the center of the Cristeros, because all people are very combatant, you know. All the people are with Cristeros, all the people.
Who here has never heard of the Cristeros at all?
No?
All right. If we asked this question in Mexico, there would have been hands up.
Uh-huh.
Because they don't know their history. They silence the history. I've asked high school kids from Mexico, wow, you must have you must love the Cristeros. They say, Cristeros? They don't know.
Because
Pardon?
Was it Cristeros?
No, not the name Cristero, but the Cristeros. Yes, the Cristeros. Yes, they're the soldiers of Christ. So
yes, in the school, not for the story, when the little children study the story of Mexico, never speak about that, and the children don't know that exist the Cristeros, but now it's more people that beginning to know, because there was many books about the life of the martyrs. But it's the new view of Vatican, you know, is he don't speak back that he insists that Cristeros are victims, but not insist that the Cristeros fight for the truth of the faith, the fight for the save the church and for the faith. That not don't speak about that. He say only are victim of the bad state, but don't explain very well what is the question. And that is in the church modern speak about Cristeros, but don't speak very well this question of the fight to defend the faith. Yeah, you understand? Yes.
Yes, everyone understands. So, well, we'll maybe just touch a little bit of the history here. Obviously, Mexico was specially chosen in a way from heaven, because Our Lady of Guadalupe came, and you know that whole story with the tilma and the miraculous tilma, and it is truly miraculous. NASA put it through a study, and they said it's just inexplicable. And they can find the reflection of 13 people in the eyeballs. And the stars on her mantle are exactly the stars of the constellations in the sky, but not looking from Earth to the stars, but above the stars down to Earth. And the constellation Virgo is on her heart. The constellation of Leo, lion, is on her stomach because she's with child. She's with the baby Jesus. And the corona borealis is on her head, the crown. So Mexico, by 1600, they already had the University of Mexico in Mexico City, a Catholic university. And in the United States, it was all still Indians. The Quakers were just landing. The Plymouth Rock, as there's an old saying among the Catholic Indians, it's too bad the Plymouth Rock didn't land on the Plymouth rather than the Plymouth on the Plymouth Rock. The Freemasons were gaining hold up in the north, but the Grand Canyon was just being discovered. And already Mexico was already a Catholic civilization. They were actually sending university professors from Mexico to Europe in the 16, 17, 1800s. That's how highly developed a Catholic civilization it became. And in the 1830s, without much detail, the Freemasonry infiltrates Mexico. By 1884, Pope Leo XIII issues the condemnation of Freemasonry in the encyclical Humanum Genus. And he's the one of many popes who will condemn Freemasonry. Bam, 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 one pope after another. Because they see the dirty work and the secrecy, the way they work in secrecy. They desecrate hosts, they have sacrilegious masses, they bind them to secrecy, and their main goal is to destroy and infiltrate the Catholic Church. And that's no secret. They made it very public. And so what happens in Mexico is in 1914, President Carranza, he comes to power. This is a great article that I'm taking from the Angelus way back in its better days in 2002. Here's about Carranza. In 1914, President Carranza put in place by the U.S. inaugurated a period of open persecution. Priests were massacred. 160 were killed in Mexico in February 1915. John Lind, one of President Woodrow Wilson's advisors, rejoiced over the news of the killing of the priests. He said, John Lind, great news. The more priests they kill in Mexico, the happier I shall be. An American parish priest, indignant about the outraging of the nuns in Veracruz, received this reply from President Wilson's personal representative, saying, after prostitution, the worst thing in Mexico is the Catholic Church. Both must disappear. And then in 1924, President Plutarco Calles comes to power. Now, how many of you have not seen the movie For Greater Glory? Have not seen it. Okay. It's not excellent, but it is good. and it shows President Calles. The actor does a pretty good job, but he was quite wicked and a high-up Freemason. In 1924, Plutarco Elias Calles became president. For this descendant of Spanish Jews, a 33rd-degree Mason, the church, he said, is the unique cause of all of Mexico's misfortunes. For him too, the church had to disappear. With the complicity of a Masonic priest, Father Perez, proclaimed by the government patriarch of the Mexican Catholic Church, Calles founded a schismatic patriotic church. So in England, they had the Anglican Church. In France, they had the Republican Catholic Church. That's those who signed the oath. In Mexico, they had the Patriotic Church. And with Vatican II, we have the Conciliar Church. As the communists were due to do later in China, the wine used in the Mass was replaced by mezcal, but the maneuver was met with widespread contempt. The government could finance the opening of 200 Protestant schools, and Calles could smooth the way for heretical denominations already well financed by the U.S., but the Mexican people remained stubbornly attached to Catholic Rome. In 1926, the president and his clique launched a new offensive which they hoped to be definitive. Now there must be a psychological revolution, Calles declared. We must penetrate and take hold of the minds of the children and the youth, because they must belong to the revolution. So notice the Masonic and communist tactic. They go after the youth. That's what they're doing right now. The sodomites and the alphabet people, they're going after the youth to get them corrupted so the next generation accepts it. The Catholic schools were shut down, the congregations expelled, Christian trade unions forbidden, numerous churches confiscated and profaned. They were turned into stables or halls or destroyed. So there's a picture of the Masons. They're at an altar, and the altar's moved out from against the wall, and the Masons are sitting down at dinner. You know that photograph.
Yes.
And remember when little Jose Sanchez, he was 14 years old, so he probably wasn't all that little. But he was kept in prison in a Catholic church, the church he was actually baptized in. And they kept horses and chickens in there. So Jose asked to go to the bathroom, and in the middle of the night, and he broke the necks of all the chickens. He wasn't cruel to animals, but he was gouged out the eyes of the horses. And when they found out who did it, the one in charge was extremely furious, because he was fighting. They were cockfights they have in Mexico, the rooster fights. They have the roosters fight each other, and they bet and they raise money on that. So that's what he did. But he told them, you don't turn God's house into a barn. So with that boy, they tied him down and did an old Aztec torture, was to cut off the bottom of the feet. And then they made him walk a whole mile to the gravesite, and then he was shot. And his last words were, Viva Cristo Rey. But his last offer was, say death to Christ the King, and you'll be free. So this boy at 14, he shouted, Viva Cristo Rey. So you've been to the shrine of Jose Sanchez, where he was buried?
You know the story? Or?
See, no. Where did you ever go to the shrine where he was buried?
No, I don't.
The cemetery.
No, I don't go.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have opportunity to visit, but maybe after I will have.
Yes.
If after you come, we can go.
Oh yeah, I'll come down and we'll make it. Where is it? Sowayo?
Yes, it's not too long. Many time of Querétaro.
Okay.
Maybe it can be 4 hours.
4-hour drive.
Yes.
Father lives in Querétaro, and Father Junipero Serra, who converted all of California and established the 21 missions, he was at the monastery in Querétaro. And so was Frs.Hewko Antonio de Jesus. He was there also, right?
Yes, Margil.
See.
Yes, he was too.
Yeah, this Franciscan priest worked incredible miracles. And before he died, he put a staff, his walking staff, in the ground in the garden of the monastery. And it grows, till today, it grows thorns that are all the shape of a cross with the marks of the nails in the hands and feet. It's miraculous, because no other thorn bushes grow that way. That's in Querétaro, right?
Yeah.
So, the use of such expressions, public school attendance became mandatory, atheism under Calles was officially taught. In religious insignia, medals, crucifixes, statues, and pictures were forbidden even at home. God was even chased from the language. The use of such expressions as adios, if God wills, or God forbid, was subject to a fine. Lastly, the priests were registered. Some states, Mexico is a federal republic, some states required them to swear not to proselytize. Others tried to command them to marry if they wished to continue in their function. Monsignor Carvana, the apostolic nuncio, protested on May 12, 1926. He was expelled. Throughout the country, Catholic public figures were assassinated. Girls coming out of the church were kidnapped, imprisoned, and raped. Monsignor Curley, the Archbishop of Baltimore, Maryland, vented his indignation, saying, Calles persecutes the church because he knows that he has Rome's approval. Our government has armed Calles as killers. Our friendship has encouraged him in his abominable enterprise, which is to destroy the idea of God in the minds and hearts of millions of Mexicans. On May 28th, Calles received the Masonic Medal of Merit from the hands of the great commander of the Scottish Rite in Mexico. On July 12, 1926, the following communique appeared in the press. International Masonry accepts responsibility for everything that is happening in Mexico and is preparing to mobilize all its forces for the methodic, integral application of the agreed-upon program for this country. So that was a declaration of open war on the church. Now, they used to have processions, huge processions of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 faithful praying the rosary when the persecution started. And there's a priest that has a little marble. He used to keep a marble as a relic that belonged to a 7-year-old boy. And this 7-year-old boy was playing marbles with his friends after the procession, and the police came up to him and said, take that banner off. He had a banner that said, Viva Cristo Rey. And the boys looked up at the police officer and he said, no, and he ran home. So the police officer followed him and knocked at the door of the house, and his father answered, and he said, your son is wearing an illegal banner. I order you to tell him to take it off. And the father said, Jose, come here. And the boy said, he came up and the officer said, take that off. And his father said, well, Jose, the officer's asking you to take that off. And Jose said, Dad, you always told us we must be ready to die for Christ the King, Cristo Rey. And the officer took his rifle, pointed it down at the boy's head, and said, take that off now. And the little boy looked up and said, no, Viva Cristo Rey, and shot him right there. 7 years old, shot his brains out right in front of his family. So he was a real martyr. So, anyway, on July 26th, an elderly shopkeeper was coldly struck down by 2 policemen in civilian clothes. What was his crime? In his shop, he had posted a sign reading, Viva Cristo Rey. The Mexicans peacefully reacted to the persecution. They boycotted state-owned enterprises, tobacco purchases, and railroad traffic were reduced by 74%. And in just a few weeks, the National Bank suffered a 7 million peso loss. And they also circulated like Budweiser. Budweiser is crashing. It's crashing. And that shows a great spirit in the United States. There's still some hope that people are boycotting Budweiser because they made a commercial with this transgender freak, and the boycott's working. So and Target too. Anyway, and they also circulated a protest petition signed by 2 million people out of a population of 15 million in Mexico. But Christians have something even better than that. They have prayer. And the country was crisscrossed by gigantic penitential processions. Thousands and thousands of faithful, barefooted, some crowned with thorns, implored God for their country. The powers that be could not tolerate that. Their heavy machine guns dispersed processions, and the first martyrs fell singing. On July 24th, 1926, Cardinal Gasperi sent a telegram from Rome to the Mexican bishops, saying, "Under no condition we will accept the registration of priests." The bishops decided to suspend public worship throughout the land starting July 31st. All the places of public worship were closed. There would be no more masses offered, nor sacraments administered throughout the country except in private chapels. This was unheard of, inexplicable a decision, unless it be they intended to push the Mexicans to revolt. For the one thing they could not bear was to be deprived of the sacraments. During the final days of July, people thronged the churches day and night, going to confession, getting baptized, getting married. And one reporter says, people began to come to put their consciences well in order, even though it was already time to begin working in the fields. With each passing day, more and more peasants streamed into the village from the neighboring hamlets, their pale faces and sorrowful eyes bespeaking their anguish. There were 3 priests in Tlatletango,
Tlatelnango.
in that parish. Not enough to confess so many people. Despite being in the confessional from dawn to dusk, with no time to eat or rest, still the priest could not confess all who came. How surprising to see someone estranged from the sacraments come to receive forgiveness of his sins, and others who lived in concubinage, which means living together without marriage, came to seek out the confessor, asking to be united in the marriage. And then the terrible hour came. This day there was to be a mass at midnight, and by the end of Vespers the church could no longer contain the immense multitude of the faithful. One after the other, the faithful would go on their knees from the door to the altar, walking on their knees. They still do that in Mexico, a lot of faithful, right? Walk from the entrance of the church to the altar on their knees. One after the other, the faithful would go on their knees from the door to the altar. No one wanted to see this most dolorous moment arrive, but God was going to permit it to come to pass. At 11:30 p.m., the bells dolefully tolled the hour of the Mass. The nocturnal adorers, the pious associations, and the Catholic social organizations with their groups and their banners were there, as were all the faithful. At midnight, the Blessed Sacrament was exposed and the Mass began. After the Gospel, our dear Father Gonzalez mounted the pulpit. He had barely gone up when all the people gathered at the foot of Jesus in the host and began to cry. The broken words that the Father spoke, full of sorrow, were interpreted by sobs. After communion at the end of Holy Mass, we were given the benediction with His Divine Majesty. So you'll receive that blessing tonight at benediction. Finally, the Father, divested of his ornaments, knelt at the foot of the altar, his eyes fixed on the image of our Lord of mercies. Silently he took leave of him and went out through the midst of the faithful. Christ and his ministers had departed. From the first days of August, the Mexican people deprived of their priests, only 200 remained with their faithful. And of their bishops, only 1 remained out of 38, because most of the bishops were exiled. But Bishop Orozco was a hero. He said Mass with the Cristeros in the mountains. And there was a cardinal in Rome who wrote him and said, "Why do you lower yourself to live among these dirty peasants?" And Bishop Orozco wrote back and said, "If you saw the faith of these Cristeros, you would compare it to the Catholics of the early church in the persecutions." Their rallying cry was that of the Mexican shopkeeper, "Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King." To keep from hearing it, the soldiers had only one solution: cut out the tongue of those whom they were going to kill, of those whom, because of these cries, they named the Cristeros. So the Freemasons were the ones who called them Cristeros, so they just took that name. One of them wrote before dying, "We are going to perish. We will not see the victory, but Mexico needs all this blood for its purification. Christ will receive the homage which is due to him." So there was a 16-year-old boy that was captured in one of the battles. They offered him tequila, they offered him girls, they offered him a pension if they would join him. And the boy said, "No, I only fight for Christ the King." So they threatened him, and he would just reply, "Viva Cristo Rey." And so one of the guards came up to him and cut his tongue out, so he was all bleeding. So the boy made the sign of the cross. And then one of the guards came up and chopped his hand off. But that wouldn't stop the faith of this boy, filled with the Holy Ghost. He took his stump and with that made the sign of the cross. And then they just shot him up with bullets. And then there's a picture of the famous Brigido, another young man, 16 years old, who was shot up. And in the picture, all the ladies of the village covered his body with flowers because he was a martyr. Blood flowed. Ireland broke its diplomatic relations with Mexico. No other state followed suit. On September 18, 1926, Pope Pius XI published the encyclical Iniquis Afflictisque, which says, "In narrating this, venerable brethren, we can scarcely keep back our tears. Some of these young men and boys have gladly met death, the rosary in their hands, and the name of Christ the King on their lips. What a beautiful spectacle this is, that is thus given to the world, to angels and to men." So that was Pope Pius XI, who was later misinformed by the bishops, saying that it was useless bloodshed, and Pius XI will give the orders to lay their weapons down. We'll come to that. In October, the Holy Father declared, "The blood of martyrs has always been the seed of blessings from heaven. How could one fail to understand that 1 year after Quas Primas, the encyclical on the social kingship of Christ in 1925, the Cristeros were signing with their blood this text on the social reign of our Lord Jesus Christ. Freemasonry understood it, and in its American journal, The New Age of December 1926, the magazine said, "The Catholic Church has perverted the Mexicans for 400 years. Calles' merit is to have delivered them from ignorance and superstition. That is why he can count on our understanding and on North America's support." So the Masons in the White House did send ammunition. They sent airplane bombers to support the Calles' Federales. And Father, feel free to jump in anytime if you have anything to add. But it is said that the Cristeros would shout the Viva Cristo Rey shout so loud that the armies of the Freemasons, their shout was Viva Satana. Long live Satan. And one general on the Federales fell off his horse with a heart attack when they shouted Viva Cristo Rey. He was so overwhelmed. In January 1927, Catholic Mexico rose. 20,000 combatants, 30,000 by the end of the year, and 50,000 in 1929. Few arms, a few rifles and carbines, but mostly hatchets, machetes, and sometimes simply sticks. Few horses, but all the people supported them, offering them their money and necessities. A Cristero peasant recounted how they set out with songs and prayers on their lips. "We were 1,000, then 5,000, then more. Everyone set out as if to go to the harvest. We firmly intended to die, angry or not, but to die for Christ." So the priests used to preach to the Cristeros about the Maccabees. And that's the beauty of the Cristero uprising, is it's like the Maccabees in the Old Testament. It was purely for the Catholic faith, purely for Christ the King. And they knew it. In 2006, Father Tim Pfeiffer and I, we took We took 30 boys to Mexico. A huge bus with stinky boys. One of them found a scorpion, put it in a bottle, but he lost his bottle on the bus. And the Mexican bus driver, he said, "No one's leaving this bus until you find that scorpion, because I sleep in here." So they found the scorpion. And but on this boys' trip, it was about 3.5 weeks in Mexico. But I had to find a living Cristero. So Father Raphael's father actually guided us out of Querétaro. And we drove and found in this little village, and this big bus arrives, and this old man is sitting there outside his front porch drinking Coca-Cola, of all things. And all these boys come off the bus and surround this poor old man. So here he was a Cristero, an old Cristero, and he was 14 when he went with his dad to fight. And he said that the first campaign was to hide behind the hedges as the federales were marching into their town to usually kill the priest, tear down the bells, tear down the altar. And when the shout was, "Viva Cristo Rey," they jumped over the hedges and ambushed them and killed them all. And the old man said, of course we had all the boys shout "Viva Cristo Rey," which they learned by heart. And when he says "Viva Cristo Rey," he says he still gets goosebumps from the fact that they were just willing to die for our Lord. They were willing to sacrifice everything for Christ the King. The old men and children, unarmed, followed behind the troops in the hope of martyrdom. The parents of Nemesio and Isidro Lopez did not want to see them depart for the war for fear that their flesh would go to feed coyotes and eagles. But the boys replied to their parents, "The coyotes may eat indeed our flesh, but our souls will ascend straight to heaven." Against them were 100 mobile columns of 1,000 men each, veritable infernal columns financed by the U.S., the Masons in Washington, the Biden administration. Light armored cars, tractor-drawn artillery, combat aircraft were supplied. The cars, tractor-drawn artillery, combat aircraft. The first clashes were bloody massacres. An officer of Calles wrote, "They are more like pilgrims than soldiers. This isn't a military campaign, it's a hunting party." The president himself predicted it will be wrapped up in less than 2 months. But when a pilgrimage takes up arms, it becomes a crusade. The Cristeros were able to equip themselves from the adversary, profiting from their cowardice or their corruption. The federales were more like pillagers, drunk on tequila and marijuana, rather than soldiers worthy of the name. On March 15, 1927, they were defeated at St. Julian, and Puerto Obristo. They left 600 dead. In November, the military attaché of the U.S. began to worry about the success of the so-called fanatics. 40% of those of whose troops were now equipped with excellent Mausers, recuperated from the enemy. How was it possible? So in the movie, do you remember Victor Ramirez? He was nicknamed Catorce. Remember in the night they sent 14 federales that surrounded his house and he had that shootout with them? That was true. That was a true story. And he killed all 14. But what they didn't put in the movie was he wrapped up their rifles, had it sent back to headquarters of the Masons, and had a note attached that said, "You'll have to send more than 14 next time." 14. The miracle. The Christiada was a succession of miracles. One was when the consecrated hosts flew into the sky before the very eyes of the squad that was getting ready to shoot them. So they would go into the Catholic churches, crowbar open the tabernacles, take the consecrated hosts and throw them on the ground, and then shoot them up. But in this case, the hosts floated in the air, and they were shooting them with their pistols. It led to the conversion of the Masonic officer who commanded it and who ended the war as a Cristero general. But there are very, very many more. God does not let himself be outdone in generosity. Here are two accounts. A Christian general told how he arrived with 350 men who had been fasting for 2 days in a miserable hamlet of only 11 straw huts. He retired to write his report. Coming out, he saw his soldiers eating with gusto, and an old woman with tears in her eyes saying over and over, "I just had a few biscuits, and yet there is enough for everyone, and what is left over is more than I had to begin with." So that might have been your great-grandmother, because they were feeding the Cristeros and miraculously more biscuits and tortillas. Another one is Dionisio, who was general of the army of the Cristeros in Colima. At one night, they were all sleeping, and he woke up in a dream in the middle of the night. Our Lady appeared to him and said in his dream, "Take the soldiers out of here. The federales are coming through." And he just thought, well, maybe it's just a crazy dream. And then his right-hand man sleeping next to him he woke up and said, "I just had this crazy dream." Then the other guy woke up, and then another one. All the soldiers had the same dream. So he took it as a sign from heaven, and they marched out of there, and within an hour, the federales came through. They would have massacred them. A spy for the Cristeros, a Cristero spy had spoken with the federales. He said, "They are sorcerers, and the one who commands them is a very valiant general mounted on a white horse. But he is accompanied by a woman. When we open fire on them, it has no effect, and when they approach us, we cannot do anything to them. They command the mist to conceal these accursed Cristeros." The spy added, "There is no white horse, and there is no woman in our army. In truth, we believe that St. James, Santiago, and the Most Blessed Virgin accompany us, and if we cannot see them, it is because we do not deserve to." So that was the first battle in Colima. Our Lady was there. And it was just about 12 Cristeros against an army of several hundred. And yet they routed them. And the report said the federales didn't see 12 Cristeros, they saw thousands of them, which were angels. And in Colima, in their victories, they would take over the arsenals and take the weapons. So that's how they could supply weapons for their army. Marvelous Cristeros, while the federal army recorded an average of 30,000 desertions annually, they did not experience a single case of treason in the Cristero army. A cobbler became sector chief, was contacted by the enemy who offered to spare his life and make him a colonel. And he answered, "I am not fighting for a rank. I am fighting for the church and for Christ the King. As soon as the victory is won, I shall return to my shoes." He was killed in combat in March 1928. With diabolical tenacity, President Calles' men tried to make their prisoners apostatize, but in vain. Father Reyes was tortured for 3 days and 2 nights. This pastor of Totolan, born in very poor circumstances as a child, he sold newspapers, had decided to remain at his post. That was enough to unleash the hatred of the federales, who tormented the priest with fire. "You say that God descends into your hands, well then, let him descend and deliver you from ours." His torturers taunted. They finished him off with bullets on the evening of Holy Wednesday. One of them testified, "We had already lodged 3 or 4 bullets in him when he aroused himself to cry out once more, 'Viva Cristo Rey.'" Father Sabas Reyes Salazar was canonized on May 21st, 2000. Well, that was Pope John Paul II, but he's a true martyr. So on this boys' trip we had, where was Saint San Ubarco Tranquilino martyred? What was that village? Maybe. There were a lot of priests that were martyred, so he might be in here. Yeah, Tranquilino Ubarco. So we found his village where he was martyred. And he would dress in disguise and say mass in the people's homes and bring sick calls and stuff. He was captured, and in his priestly vestments, they hanged him on a tree, and that's how he died. But there were going into the village, there's two huge rows of sycamore trees, and they're gigantic. And they hanged him on one of them, and it's the only tree that died. And still today, that dead tree is still there. The stump is still there and venerated as the shrine of the tree that held the dead body of this priest who was hanged in his vestments. Valencia Gallardo, a Cristero leader, was tied to a stake and tortured, but only cried out throughout, "Viva Cristo Rey." They tore out his tongue and freed one of his hands from the bonds, and he pointed to heaven. They cut off his hand and then split open his skull with their rifle butts. Admirable Cristeros, the Cristiada was not a counter-revolution with its share of exactions. It was the opposite of a revolution. Read the order of the day of one of its generals, killed in combat in 1927. This is the instructions from one of the generals. Disciplinary measures affecting the Southern Division. The division chiefs of the south of Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit, and western Michoacan of the National Liberation Army have adopted the following measures. Listen to the code of the Army. Imagine this for the U.S. Marines. First, to render an official, public, and solemn homage to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Sovereign King of our Army, and to humbly and lovingly consecrate to him all the works and all the persons of this division. 2, to never omit under any pretext the daily group recitation of the Rosary to the Blessed Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, and to accord this observance the same priority as a strict disposition of military regulation. 3, whenever possible, to arrange things to allow all the leaders, officers, and soldiers to officially fulfill the precepts of Sunday worship, confession, and communion. 4, to guarantee divine protection during the battles by making the army and the Catholics prepare themselves by humble, confident prayer and by recommending making acts of perfect contrition. How's that for a code? Their awareness of the supernatural character of their fight did not lead the Cristeros to neglect temporal realities. Fight and organize, fight and moralize was one of their mottos. In the liberated territories, administrators were appointed, Catholic schools were open, more than 200. Public sins, drunkenness, prostitution were suppressed. So yes, whenever the Cristeros had victory, the families would almost instantly put up Catholic schools for their children. So now with the devastation, our parents are having homeschooling, which is actually the only solution. You can't send your kids to public school, nor the Novus Ordo Catholic schools. There was a case of in some of the Cristero rules, they were allowed anyone caught abducting a girl, they had to be shot. So in one case, one of the Cristeros visited a girl that I guess he knew, but that broke the law of the code of the military for the Cristeros. He didn't do anything, but it broke the law. So the general said, "Why'd you do this? I have to kill you." And he said, "Look, don't let my friends kill me. Put me on the horse, tie my hands behind my back, and send me into my enemies. Let them kill me." So that's what they did. They put him on the horse, pat the horse in the rear end, and he went riding into the enemies, and he was shouting, "Viva Cristo Rey," and they shot him. And in one case, there was a Cristero in the middle of the war. His rifle ran out of bullets. He ran out of ammunition. And the enemy was coming on him, so he broke his rifle in half and held it up as a cross, shouting "Viva Cristo Rey" as they shot him and trampled him over. Who were these new crusaders? They were the people. As one federale wrote, "We run no risk of making a mistake by massacring one and all. They all resist." They were 95% rural folk, peasants, artisans, miners, muleteers, or rural landholders. There was, for instance, Luis Navarro Origel, with a degree in philosophy and a third order Franciscan. In 1926, he took the lead of the men of the village where he was mayor. He declared, "I am going to kill for Christ those who kill Christ, and perhaps die for him if need be. I am going to offer the blood of redemption." He fell at the head of his troops on August 10th, 1928, at the age of 30. The city folk who joined them were especially students and the women involved in the St. Joan of Arc brigades. Some of these 25,000 heroines, women and girls, were only 14 years old. They acted as liaison agents or scouts, nurses, collectors of money or munitions in the arsenals, where they infiltrated as workers. Woe to those who fell into the clutches of the federales' hardened soldiers, but they never betrayed any information. So any women that were captured, they were always faithful. So there were some heroic women, and it was well portrayed in the movie For Greater Glory. Actually, it kind of portrayed their role quite well. Beautiful youth of Mexico. Jose Sanchez was 14. In February 1928, he was surrounded by the federales. He gave up his horse to the group leader, who was wounded and covered his retreat. Running out of ammunition, he was captured. Jose said, "Know it well, I am not surrendering. I have merely run out of ammo." He was slaughtered. A note was found in his pocket. "My dearest mom, here I am a captive, and they are going to kill me. I am happy. The only thing that troubles me is that you are going to cry. Don't cry. We shall meet again. Signed, Jose, killed for Christ the King." At 14. So that tells you a lot, that the faith was in their blood, these youngsters. And there was a youth movement, the ACGM, which was a
Association Catholique of the Jeunesse, Juventud Cristiana, Católica. Juventud
Yes, so-
Católica.
the Catholic youth movement. Yes. Yes. So a lot of these youth belong to this, something like the Eucharistic Crusade in the U.S. Manuel, here we are. Tomasino was a member of the executive committee of the ACJM, here it is, Mexican Catholic Youth Association, and prefect of the Congregation of Mary. Arrested, he was offered his freedom if he talked. "Really, you would be making a mistake. Free, I would continue to fight for Christ the King. For us, the fight for our freedom of worship is not optional." In August 1927, he was hanged. He was 17 years old. Tomasino. Another boy, Manuel Bonilla, a student, kept a daily diary. "I well know that to do great things, God uses little ones, and that help does not come whence we were expecting it. I trust in God's goodness. All these sacrifices will not be in vain." Manuel was shot at 22. He was shot at 22 years of age on Good Friday in 1927 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In 1942, his body was discovered perfectly intact. So he was martyred with Joaquin da Silva, and both of them, Joaquin was 27 years old, Manuel was 22 here. And Joaquin said to him, "Manuel, remove your hat, because soon we will be before the throne of God." And he took off his hat, and they refused blindfold. They shouted "Viva Cristo Rey," and they were shot. And Luis Segura Vilches, who was martyred with Father Pro and his brother Umberto and another guy, Tirado. Luis Vilches was a lawyer. And he went to the Freemasons and said, "Look, if I tell you who was behind the plot to kill Obrigado, the president. If I tell you, will you let Father Pro and the others free from prison? And they said, yes. He said, I'll tell you who did it. It's me. He didn't really do it, but he was hoping to save Father Pro and his friends. But they reneged on their promise, and they martyred all four. But when Luis Segura Vilches was martyred after Father Pro extended his hand with the rosary and crucifix and shouted, Viva Cristo Rey, and he was shot. Luis Segura Vilches opened his chest with a big crucifix. He said, shoot here, I'll show you how a Catholic dies. The year 1928 was terrible. The infernal columns had received the order to deport the rural population to concentration camps, where famine and epidemics decimated them. At the least show of resistance, the federales would massacre them. Harvests and flocks were seized, grazing lands burned, and villages destroyed by the thousands. Despite this scorched earth, sounds like chemtrails, doesn't it? Despite this scorched earth, sounds like the 15-minute cities, doesn't it? It's all over again. Same communist policies. Despite this scorched earth policy, the Cristeros stood fast like latter-day Maccabees. In 1929, the government renounced its policy of governing the countryside. 3/4 of the inhabitable Mexico was in the hands of the troops of Christ the King. Victory was in reach, especially as the riffraff in Mexico were fighting each other. And in the United States, Hoover, who was not a Mason, was elected president. Then they learned that the secret negotiations between the Mexican government and the Vatican had resulted in an accord. On June 21st, the Mexican episcopate, the bishops, except for one of its members, His Excellency José de Jesus Manriquez y Zarate, signed a resolution of the conflict with the ruling power on bases negotiated by a U.S. Jesuit, a Father Walsh. The accord provided 1, immediate unconditional ceasefire, 2, the resumption of public worship, beginning the next day, June 22nd. But that was all. The same laws were still in place, forbidding Catholic schools, forbidding the priest cassock, still persecuting the church. So it wasn't a good agreement. It was like Bishop Fillet and Pope Benedict XVI. We'll give you recognition. We'll give you canonical solution and jurisdiction if you accept to Vatican II enlightens tradition and traditions enlightens Vatican II. And if you accept the new Code of Canon Law, and you accept that the new Mass is legitimately promulgated. So very similar. It was not a good agreement. And the generals of the Cristeros knew this. And Gorostieta said, we don't fear Rome, we don't fear the Masons, we don't fear our enemies, but we fear an agreement between the bishops and the Freemasons. That's what we fear. And the Freemasons, they don't keep their promise. This agreement restored them to the same situation that prevailed in 1926, with all the anti-Catholic laws then in effect, including the registration of priests. So it was not good at all. It was like the Summorum Pontificum. It was like the Doctrinal Declaration. You still make peace with the Vatican II and the new Mass. In the text, the Cristeros are called fanatics, directed by a few third-rate priests. Their revolt was an error, an imprudence, even a sin. They must lay down their arms under pain of excommunication. So the bishops, the liberal bishops, sided with this. Jesus de Delgado, commander-in-chief of the Cristeros, addressed his troops, his voice breaking with sorrow. He said, His Holiness the Pope, by the intermediary of the most excellent apostolic nuncio, has decided for reasons which are unknown to us, but which as Catholics we accept, that public worship will be resumed tomorrow without the law being changed. This arrangement has wrested from us that which is most noble and most holy on our flag. At the moment when the Church has declared that she will resign herself to what she had obtained, consequently the National Guard assumes responsibility for the conflict. As for ourselves as men, we have satisfaction that no one can take from us. The National Guard does not disappear defeated by its enemies, but rather abandoned by the very ones who were to be the first to receive the fruit of our sacrifices and abnegation. Hail Christ! Those who for you are going to humiliation, to exile, and perhaps to an unglorious death, with the most fervent love we salute you, and once more proclaim you as King of our country. So, this is what happened. June 21st, 1929. The Cristeros in the town squares laid down their weapons, and the Freemasons, breaking their promise, raised their rifles and shot and killed more in that day than the 3 years of the war. They totally betrayed their agreement. You never trust the Freemasons. That's why Archbishop Lefebvre said, never make an agreement with modernist Rome. They're in the grip of Masonry. You don't make agreements. Either they proclaim Christ the King and restore all the papal teachings of the good popes and condemn Vatican II in the new Mass, or no agreement. That's what Bishop Fillet did.
Yes.
6,000 Cristeros obeyed and were immediately massacred. In 3 years, they had only lost 5,000 men in combat. The Mexican bishops decreed the excommunication of the Cristero priests. So the bishops turned on the priests and the Cristeros. And the bishops gave the names of the generals of the Cristeros. And for 3 years after and longer, they were hunting them down and killing them, hanging them up on telephone poles. You know the famous photograph of the bodies on the telephone poles. So they were betrayed by their bishops. Sound familiar? But those who had not been killed during the war, 180 of them had been already martyred. All was lost. The new president, the Masonic lawyer Portes Gil, rejoiced. At the summer solstice banquet, he acknowledged his astonishment at the unconstitutional capitulation of a victorious army and his intention to continue the fight. The fight did not begin yesterday. The fight is eternal. The fight began 20 centuries ago. Indeed, but the novelty was that the Vatican was not on the right side. Freemasonry, condemned by all the popes from the 18th century, from Clement XII in 1738 to the end of the 19th by Leo XIII, who equated Freemasonry with Satanism, had infiltrated the church at the highest levels of the hierarchy. Were not Della Chiesa, the future Benedict XV, and Errati, the future Pius XI, were they not the protégés of Cardinal Rampolla? In 1926, Rampolla was the cardinal. He was going to be elected, him or Pius X. And thank God, the Austro-Hungarian emperor vetoed, and the election went to Pius X. If Rampolla was elected Pope at that time, we would have had Vatican II back then. He was a Mason. He was known to be a Mason. And if you look at photographs of Cardinal Rampolla, he looks like Count Dracula in the movie. He really does. In 1926, was it not Pius XI who condemned Action Française in accordance with its sect's, the Freemasons' desires? In 1928, was it not Father Valette? Remember him? The 5-day exercises? He was expelled from Spain and his work suppressed by a hierarchy that preferred to favor the Opus Dei. So the Opus Dei is like Masonic clergy. It's big in Spain. Is Opus Dei big in Mexico?
Yes.
Yeah, there are many, yes, but more in Spain. More in Spain, yes.
They took over the university in Guadalajara that was Catholic and they communist.
Yeah.
Took it over in the 80s.
Yeah, I heard about that. When from 1934 to 37, a new Christiana was launched. So that's 1934. This was the second wave of the Cristeros. But this time, the clergy turned their back on the Cristeros. And this was when Father Pedro de Maldonado was killed. He was carrying the Blessed Sacrament. The Freemasons surrounded him and told him, give them the host. He refused. So they took him in a building and they beat him with their rifles, and they stripped him partly, held him outside the window of a concrete building, and with his face facing the wall, they pounded his face into the wall with his hands tied. So he was just all bloody. And they still couldn't open his hand with the pyx of the Blessed Sacrament. So they beat him to death, and even after he was dead, his hand would not open until a bishop came and his hand opened for the bishop to take it. But one priest who lived in Mexico told me that people started coming to put their handkerchiefs to the blood of the martyr, Father Pedro de Maldonado, and the Masons got upset with that, so they took a spray and washed off all the blood. Next day, they were back collecting blood because the blood came back. Third day, they washed it off. Third day, still there. So the Masons ended up taking down the whole building.
Father, you know that here in St. Mary's, they had a relic from Father Maldonado.
Yeah, I have one too. Father Maldonado. You know anything about him?
No, I know well his life, but it's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of relics of his surplices. All right, let's wrap this up. I just want to wrap this up because the final is very, very good here. The saga of the Cristeros reminds us of the famous rising of the Vendée during the French Revolution, and the two epics have many points in common. First, the refusal of priests to take an oath of loyalty to the state. So the refusal of priests to take the oath in England, France, Spain, Mexico, and now the oath is with Vatican II in the new Mass. Once you accept that, that's like the oath of betrayal. So all those priestly groups, and now the new SSPX, signing that oath, agreeing with the doctrinal declaration, it's like the oath of fidelity to Masonry. That's really what it is. Second, the creation by the state of a schismatic church, so in this case, the conciliar church. 3, religious persecution. Pope Francis now trying to crush the Latin Mass. Pope John Paul II trying to crush and excommunicate tradition. Pope Paul VI suspending Archbishop Lefebvre illegally to crush tradition. 4, part of the episcopate's indifference to the suffering of the flock. The bishops don't care. And listen to this. This is the footnote. Father, you're going to laugh when you hear this. The letter of Monsignor de Mercy, Bishop of Lucon, in exile in Italy. So this is the French Revolution now. And this bishop's in exile in Italy. And listen to what he's worried about. On June 1st, 1793, the bishop wrote, "For a long time I hoped to be able to save the furniture I left at Lucon. I might have, but the troubles in the Vendée harmed my cause, even though I do not take their side." Sounds like something out of Broadstairs. I'm worried about my who knows what, but forget about helping the real fighters for the faith. So he's worried about his furniture, and he's a bishop of the Vendée. He's worried about his furniture. It reminds me of bishops worried about Charles Dickens and Beethoven in a time when we need bishops to save the faith and really back the resistance instead of confusing the resistance by promoting new Mass miracles. And new Mass nourishes your faith. See? So, and what do you have to say, Father, about the silence of the so-called resistance bishops? They're not really resistance; they're the fake resistance.
But I think there is a problem general, because it's not only there is in the society, St. Pius XII, the silence of many problems that are very actual, and there is a phenomenon not only in the new church, but now is in the in the society of some SSPX,
St. Pius X.
St. Pius X, and there are some similar and some priests of the resistance that don't speak about some problems, but not all. Not and it's not possible to speak about all, but we need to speak about all the big problems, and that is necessary to speak about that, because the faithful need orientation about that. I speak about the big problems of the church today. It's necessary the priest make a position public, because it's very important. Not all the things, because we can't speak about all things, but the principal, the more important, we need to speak. And there is a silence of many priests that before speak well, and after, I don't know why, are more and more silent.
You follow?
Yeah, there
Good
is.
priests who used to condemn Vatican II, the new Mass, against all the errors, now they're silent in the society.
And there is a phenomenon is coming too in the resistance. Some priests, I don't say all, but there are some priests that take this position. Is bad, because we can evolve there after, because the silence make us not how do you say have a faiblesse for us, you know. Es una debilidad para nosotros el hecho de no hablar de ciertas cosas.
It's a willingness of the priest not to talk about some things.
Right, the silence of the priests on important doctrine issues.
Yes,
And
because
bishops too, like
with the
Zendeas.
time, it's a phenomenon that with the time we have more and more witness, no? Debilidad.
Witness,
And other things that's necessary to fight always is the problem. Like in the problem of Cristeros, there are bishops that are Catholic, but in the beginning he say to Cristeros, you are okay. But after, when there is the persecution, there is the persecution of pression of the Masonry, ecclesiastic Masonry of Rome, and the bad bishops of United States too. They make pressure to the bishops, Mexican bishops, to finish this war, because they have contamination of liberal spirit, you know. And I think the Bishop of Mexico are contaminated too of liberal spirit. That's why after he take another decision to accept, make a pact with the states, and because here he are not liberal, but he are spirit liberal, and that's why here want to finish with the war, and that is the spirit of the liberal. And I think this phenomenon is the same in the tradition, because before, you know, if you read the conferences of Bishop Fele and Father Schmidberger before 2000, he say it's dangerous to make accords with Rome. It's very dangerous. We need to be very careful with that. But after we changed his position after 2000, and there is a problem. I think it's not sufficient to say I am traditionalist. We need to purify the spirit liberal. That spirit liberal is fabulous. What you say? It's a witness, no? Debilidad. It's a witness for us, the spirit liberal. We can be contaminated with this spirit liberal, And with the time, there is an evolution. And I think maybe Bishop Fele before speak well about the problems of tradition, the dangers of Rome, but he have spirit liberal, and it's a question of time. And after he changed his opinion because he don't are really anti-liberal. He are Catholic, but not anti-liberal. We need to be anti-liberal. It's not sufficient to be Catholic, to say, I am Catholic, I am traditionalist, but I am not anti-liberal. It's necessary to be anti-liberal. And that's why the bishops in Mexico, after change, become take compromise with the Freemasonry. And now the compromise is with Rome, with the council, because it's not sufficient to see I am Catholic. We need to be fighters, fighters Catholic. We need to be make the combat against spirit liberal, because it's more subtle. It's not only the ideas of liberalism, but it's the spirit liberal in this society, in all places. It's very difficult that we contaminate of this spirit liberal.
Mm-hmm.
You understand?
Everyone follow? Yeah, we must be Catholic, but anti-liberal Catholics.
It's not sufficient to be traditionalist, because there is a moment in the seminary that Bishop, there are many seminarists that say the French seminarists, because the French people have tendency very accentuated to the spirit liberal. And when we understand that many seminaries say it's not necessary to criticize the errors, we need to accept the truth, and to live the truth is sufficient. It's not necessary to criticize all time the errors. And when Bishop Lefebvre understands that, he make an homily to say, no, that is not true. We need to be anti-communist, anti-liberal, anti-modernist, anti-communist, etc. Because it's not sufficient to say the truth. We need to denounce the error, contrary, and to make combat to the error. It's not sufficient to say, I am a good person, and not do something against the bad ideas.
Yes.
You need to combat the malady. We not only say I have a good health, I don't take medicine because I am a good health. I don't take something against the malady. It's necessary to take to be anti. That the spirit liberal don't like that. The people that have the spirit liberal don't like to say we are anti. We are fighters against the error, against the bad things, the bad people, etc., etc., etc. I am clear.
Yes. Is everyone?
Yeah? You understand? Yeah.
All right. We're well behind supper, our lunch. But let me just close. I promise this is the last point. Just to encourage you mothers and ladies, Doña Guadalupe, mother of Luis Navarro Origel, would say, when she was told that 2 of her boys had already been dead, she sent 4 sons of hers into the war. She said, I offered the life of my 4 boys to Christ, but the Lord came up short. He only took 2. So that's the spirit of these good ladies. So we'll just go straight to lunch. Forget about, we'll say grace over there. God bless. Viva Cristo Rey.
Viva Cristo Rey.